So we'll kind of begin, and sort of the main sort of theme, I guess, of this whole lecture really is this very simple, very straightforward question: what is pain? Okay, what is it good for? What is it serve? And so this question, kind of keep in the back of your mind as we're kind of going through. It's going to kind of come in and out. We're going to be trying to kind of address this sort of big, broad, philosophical question. And then what we'll do, I think, is to kind of get down into kind of the anatomy and some of the physiology of pain. So we'll ask questions like, where does pain come from? How does it arise? And then how does it happen? So some of the basic signaling mechanisms and some of the standard pathways. And then at the end, what we'll do is we'll kind of look at treatment approaches to pain. And again, we'll keep this very general. We won't really focus on a specific disease, but we'll look at sort of the broad sort of strategies that we use, basically the fundamental principles of how we go about treating and dealing with patients in pain. So if we're going to start, we'll kind of begin with that sort of overarching large question: what is pain? And probably the best place to begin is kind of with a solid definition. And so this is what the International Association for the Study of Pain, sort of the large sort of organization that kind of coordinates pain research and clinical trials and pain studies. This is the official sort of the Bible, if you will, and this is the kind of definition that's been handed down to us. And I think, before you sort of looked at this and read this, if I was to sort of just ask you on the street, how would you define pain? I think we all sort of have an intrinsic sort of sense of what pain is. I'm not sure many of us would actually be able to come up with such a complex sort of statement like this. We already sort of see from this that pain is actually probably a lot more than we naturally think of it. So what do we have if we kind of read through this very simply? We have an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage, or could be just described in terms of damage. So I think we sort of see where this definition is going to lead us as we kind of move down the talk, that we're dealing with something that's quite complex, and it's not just a simple sort of stimulus response property. We have a lot of other sort of physiological and even psychological factors coming into play. And so keep this kind of in mind again. We're going to kind of keep revisiting this definition a bit as we sort of move down the line. Okay, so basically we can sort of take pain and we can carve it into sort of two very distinct categories. There's actually probably many different categories of pain. Probably the simplest and first sort of path we're going to do is really break pain down into the sort of the two sort of fundamental categories. So the first sort of pain that we would come across, and this is the kind of daily, day-to-day pain that we've all probably experienced in this room, is typically classified as nociceptive pain. And you'll often hear people talk about this as good pain, or the pain that really is really necessary for us. So basically what we have is a system within our nervous system that is going to detect kind of the outside world. And it's going to be looking for things that are potentially harmful or that could really cause damage to the organism, and we're an organism, so this is true for sort of any sort of species in the world. And the word nociceptive really comes from that. The word nocere is Latin for harm. And so here we have sort of a harm detection system kind of inbuilt into the nervous system. And so these are the typical sort of things that the system can detect, sort of really large sort of changes in heat, intense cold, lots of forces can impinge on the body. And then we have the wiring in the system to sort of basically pull away from these things and distract them and basically escape that prevents sort of further ongoing damage from occurring. And so this system is often sort of considered adaptive. It's very useful, and it serves this very useful protective function. It acts as this early warning system. So this is kind of the good pain. We tend to sort of think of pain as something we try to avoid, but in fact, it's actually a very important and fundamental thing for survival. So the converse of this is sort of the abnormal or pathological pain. Now here we actually have a very maladaptive situation that develops, and this is where we'll sort of start looking later in the talk at some of the causes and consequences of pathological pain. So here we have pain that's really not serving a useful purpose anymore. This is no longer an early warning system keeping you from your hand in the fire. This is pain that tends to arise in people or in animal models too, which we can discuss. That basically arises usually from some more severe damage, and typically damage to the nervous system, either out in the periphery or quite often in the central nervous system. And so something happens within the nervous system that flips over, and now basically you have sort of maladaptive responses to stimuli. And we're going to get into the mechanisms in a few slides. But basically the take-home message here is in these states you have pain lasting way beyond the time of injury, or healing has occurred and pain keeps persisting. And it's really not serving any sort of useful measure. We no longer need it. And this is the real clinical problem, because this, as we'll see later, is really the pain very difficult to treat for a variety of reasons. Okay, so let's take a step into the next sort of area, so looking at where is the pain come from. We're going to have a little look at some of the anatomy. It's probably best to kind of work from the periphery and build our way up towards the brain. So before we get out to the periphery, it's probably handy to kind of take a look at the spinal cord first. And I think most people have seen these kinds of diagrams. These are known as dermatome match. So we can sort of think of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is sort of segregated into these 5 broad segments. So you have a cervical segment, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And then within each of these segments, you have little subdivisions. So in cervical, we have a C1 to C5. And then you can see that on the map, basically, C1 down to C5. So basically, our whole body is now sort of translated onto specific levels of the spinal cord. And that's going to happen all the way down to the sacral. So now the outside world is kind of coming into, it's going to come into the spinal cord through this route. And here now we're going to get out to the periphery. Because at every level of this spinal cord, so from C1, C2, C3, down into the lumbar, on either side of the spinal cord are sort of first line of sensory detection. These are the primary sensory neurons, and they live in these little clusters sitting on either side, known as the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, so if we kind of peer inside these dorsal root ganglion and actually look at these sensory neurons a little more carefully, what we find ourselves, particularly if I kind of typically classified as a pseudo-unipolar cell. They basically have a cell body and then 2 branches. One going out to the periphery, so out into that target tissue, so that strip of tissue where the level is at. And then one projecting into the spinal cord. So now, not every sensory neuron in this dorsal ganglion is made the same. We have very specific sort of classes of cells that are going to be serving different functions and different roles. So, simply put, we can sort of slice the cells down into 2 broad categories. And again, there's probably more subtle sort of subdivisions within each of these categories, but for simplicity's sake and for our purposes, the 2 categories will work just fine. So if we look very closely at a dorsal root ganglion, and again, at any level of that spinal cord, we can have the same sort of composition. We're going to have the first class of cells, typically known as these large light neurons. So these are cells that are typically classified as A alpha or A beta cells. So these are the cells now that are interested in the outside world in things like light, low threshold touch, proprioception, basically the sort of nonsense of things. These are things that, when your shirt is on your sleeve, you know that something's actually touching your skin. Now the second class of cell is probably more interesting for us in terms of our meaning lecture, is this other broad category that is classified as the small dark population. So here now we have cells that are known as A deltas or C. And these are the cells that are now really interested in things like pain and temperature. So things that are potentially tissue damaging, these are the cell types that mediate these. And these are often, and I'll probably kind of keep referring to these as the nociceptors. So these cells are harm receptors, if you will. So they're going to be looking for anything that is sort of intensely hot or intensely cold that again can signal to you and I that we've got to get out of here because it's going to sort of affect our survival or cause severe injury. Okay, so if we look at the properties of these cells, we can sort of see that the sort of the anatomical and morphological features of the cells actually translate quite nicely into their physiological function and then their sort of broad sort of sensory aspects that we detect. So if we look at those A alphas and A betas, sort of these large diameter cell bodies, well, these are very large diameter cell bodies, and their axons, the 2 axon branches, are actually very large and have a very broad diameter as well. And the other fact of these axons is they're very heavily myelinated. very, very rapidly. So things get transmitted very quickly. Now, the A delta cells are considerably smaller in terms of their cell body size and the sort of the cross-sectional area of their axons as well. And these A delta cells are myelinated, but only have a very thin sort of myelin sheath on them. So the physical properties, these are going to conduct at a much slower rate than the A alphas and A betas. And then we have that third class of, second class of small dark cells, if you will, these sort of unmyelinated C fibers. So these are the cells that have the tiniest and smallest diameter cell body. They're very fine, very thin, small diameter axons, and they're completely unmyelinated. So because they don't have this myelin sheath, the impulses in the axon conducting down the sheath is much slower compared to this good insulated axon here. And so if we look over into this B side, we can see how these sort of morphological features translate into the physiology and the functionality of the cell. So the A delta, A alphas, and A betas will conduct impulses very quickly. So if the stimulus is here, you get a rapid rise and then a drop. The A deltas come in much slower, and then way over here at a much longer time point, that stimulus, those C nociceptors are going to start. The information from the C nociceptors is finally going to arrive at the spinal cord. And then so if we want to translate this into sort of a functional sensation, if you will, sort of think about, you know, putting our hand down on a thumbtack or putting our hand down on a hot stove. We all probably have experienced this, and we think back to these times. Typically, you know, your hand goes down on the stove. Often you sort of have this sense that your hand was actually there for several seconds before you kind of realized it withdrew. And that's really because that the A deltas do take a little bit of time to send the signal through. But it is that A delta fiber that is telling you get your hand off the stove, that initial sort of ouch that you feel. And then, a couple seconds later, often you start to feel that kind of, if your hand is on the stove long enough, you might start to feel this kind of dull, aching throb from that injury. And that's typically called the second pain, and that's our slow kind of conducting C fiber. Okay, so we've got a few fundamentals of the anatomy and the system itself. So we can sort of, again, kind of take a little aside and kind of get into the philosophy again and start looking at some of the theories that people have about pain. And the place to really begin, because this was sort of the dominant theory, and is still actually kind of element in some circles, was the idea of a specificity theory, so the specificity theory of pain. And this is probably one of the most famous sort of medical drawings. You see it in many, many talks, not only necessarily related to pain, but just of the nervous system in general. So the specificity theory, and really, we just kind of read it off the slide, is sort of dedicated to this idea that in all the organisms, in all of us, we have a very specific pain system that's dedicated to carry these messages about, you know, noxious, potentially tissue-damaging stimuli from the periphery to a very specific center in our brain that will then process the pain signal. And so this theory actually was originally formulated way back in the 1600s. So this is one of René Descartes' famous drawings. And Descartes didn't know about nociceptors back then, and didn't know about small dark cells of large myelinated atoms. So this was all very theoretical to him, but you know, with the advent and the discovery of these different cell types, it sort of lent a lot of weight to this overarching theory. And so really what the main theme here, or the thing to kind of remember, is that what specificity theory suggests is that you have this kind of one-to-one mapping of a stimulus to a response. You have a direct, invariant relationship between this sensory dimension and the physical stimulus. And so this was kind of the dominant sort of theory of pain. And I think it's almost the most intuitive theory of pain that we tend to sort of all have. But a lot of people never really specificity. A lot of anatomical data sort of come out in support, and we see that we have these specialized cells and convey information. But a lot of people kind of felt that the real world doesn't really fit what we know about